My name is Jessica Limpton. I'm 20 years old, and before you assume this is just another story about a random college student, I need you to know that my life turned upside down long before I even thought about college. My father passed away when I was 15, and with him, a part of my mother's light and my own soul. He was the pillar of our home, the easy laugh, the voice that calmed any storm. After he left, a heavy, constant silence settled in, and the luxury apartment he loved so much in the heart of Boston became an echo of memories. My mother, Sarah, inherited not only the pain, but also the responsibility of keeping everything afloat. She's a strong woman, always has been, but widowhood left her with a vulnerability that I, in my youth, took a long time to understand. It was into this void that they arrived. My paternal grandmother, Martha, and my Aunt Carol. They had lived with us before, but their presence became more permanent after my father's funeral. Grandma Martha, with her aura of an all-knowing, demanding matriarch, and Aunt Carol, Grandma Martha's only daughter, who for 10 years had lived under the cloak of chronic depression, or so she claimed. They settled into one of the guest rooms, which quickly became their room, and the dynamic of the house shifted subtly, almost imperceptibly at first. I remember one afternoon, shortly after Dad had passed, when I was sitting in the living room, trying to read a book, but my mind could only relive his last moments. My mother walked in, her eyes teary, and Grandma Martha, who was sitting on the sofa, just said, without taking her eyes off the television, "Sarah, you need to be strong now. You can't afford to fall apart. There are bills to pay." I saw my mother's shoulder slump slightly. She just nodded without saying a word and went to the office. In that moment, I felt a shiver. It wasn't comfort. It was a demand, and that demand would only increase. Years passed, and the apartment my father had designed with such care, with its wide windows overlooking the Charles River, began to feel less like a home and more like a luxury hotel, with permanent guests who weren't paying the bill. My mother worked tirelessly, managing the investments my father had left, and, to supplement, taking on some consulting projects. She was the engine that kept our lives on track, while Grandma Martha and Aunt Carol lived in a kind of perpetual vacation. Aunt Carol, in particular, was a mystery. She talked incessantly about her debilitating depression, but seemed to have plenty of energy to plan road trips across the United States. I'd see her researching routes, boutique hotels, and fancy restaurants on her laptop, always with a discreet smile on her face. "Aunt Carol, where are you going this time?" I asked once, when I saw her with a map open in the kitchen. She looked at me with a forced air of weariness. "Oh, Jessica, I need some peace. Depression is a constant battle, you know. Maybe I'll go to Arizona, to the desert. They say silence helps." And off she would go, in the brand new car my mother had loaned her, disappearing for weeks at a time, while my mother stretched herself thin to cover household expenses, my college tuition, and, of course, Grandma Martha and Aunt Carol's needs. I noticed my mother's dark circles growing deeper, the worry line on her forehead more pronounced. I tried to help as best I could, studying for scholarships, working part-time at the college library, but I felt it was a drop in the ocean. Mother's Day had always been a sensitive date for us since my father passed. My mother tried to maintain the tradition, but the genuine joy had been replaced by a subtle melancholy. This year, however, the melancholy gave way to a sharp pain, a blow I saw hit my mother squarely. Grandma Martha had organized an intimate brunch in our own apartment, which, as usual, expanded to include her friends and acquaintances. The dining table was laden with expensive dishes and fresh flowers, all paid for by my mother, of course. I was sitting next to her, watching the activity. Aunt Carol, who had miraculously overcome her depression for the occasion, was in high spirits, chatting loudly with Grandma Martha. Then came time for presents. Grandma Martha, with a smile that seemed rehearsed for a commercial, picked up a velvet box and a small designer bag. "My dear Carol," she said, with a melodious voice I rarely heard directed at my mother or me, "you have been so strong, so resilient. This year, I want you to know how much I love and admire you." Aunt Carol opened the box, and a diamond necklace sparkled under the chandelier light. It was dazzling, the kind of jewelry you see in exclusive jewelry store windows. Aunt Carol gasped, her eyes welling up. "Mom, it's too much." "Nothing is too much for my daughter," Grandma Martha replied, hugging her. "And there's more." From the designer bag, she pulled out an envelope. Inside were tickets for a 2-week first-class Mediterranean cruise. The room erupted in applause, and Aunt Carol cried with joy, hugging her mother with an effusiveness I had never seen. I felt a knot in my throat, and when I looked at my mother, I saw a shadow cross her face. She tried to smile, but her eyes were fixed on the necklace and the tickets. Then, Grandma Martha turned to my mother, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "And for you, Sarah." She held out a small paper bag. My mother took it, and I watched her open it with an almost painful slowness. Inside, there was a plastic flower, the kind you buy at a dollar store for about $5, and a generic supermarket card. The card read, "Happy Mother's Day," and below it, in Grandma Martha's hurried handwriting, "Thanks for everything, Sarah." Silence fell over the table. It was a heavy, awkward silence. I could feel the guests' gazes, some curious, others visibly uncomfortable. My mother squeezed the plastic flower in her hand, and I swear I saw a solitary tear trickle from the corner of her eye before she quickly wiped it away. It's lovely, Martha." "Thank you," she managed to say, her voice almost a whisper. But Grandma Martha had already turned back to Aunt Carol, resuming their conversation about cruise destinations, as if the previous moment had never happened. My mother stood there, holding the plastic flower, a gift that screamed contempt amidst the luxury and ostentation. In that instant, I felt a cold anger and a determination I had never experienced before. I knew something had to change, and that my mother couldn't face this alone. What I didn't know was how deep the web of dependence and exploitation we were caught in truly was, and how high the price of our freedom would be. That Mother's Day became a turning point. It wasn't just the plastic flower or the diamond necklace. It was the public humiliation, the blatant disrespect my mother suffered, right there, in our own home. I watched her during the rest of the brunch, trying to maintain her composure, participating in conversations with a forced smile. But her eyes were distant, lost somewhere I couldn't reach. Grandma Martha and Aunt Carol, on the other hand, were ecstatic, as if they had just won the lottery, completely oblivious to the pain they had inflicted. I sat next to my mother, took her hand under the table, and squeezed it gently. She gave me a quick glance, a flash of gratitude, and I knew we weren't alone in this. When the guests finally left, the apartment plunged into a heavy silence, different from the silence of my father's passing. This was a silence of resentment, of unspoken truths. Grandma Martha and Aunt Carol retreated to their room, probably to continue celebrating their gifts. My mother went to the kitchen, and I followed her. She was washing dishes, with mechanical movements. Her shoulders slumped. "Mom?" I started, not quite knowing what to say. She sighed, turning to me, and I saw the contained anger in her eyes, mixed with a deep sadness. "I can't take it anymore, Jessica. I just can't take it anymore." That night, sitting in the dark living room, with only the city light streaming through the window, my mother told me things I had only imagined. She began to talk about how Grandma Martha had always been controlling, how she and my father had to fight for their independence, and how, after his death, Grandma Martha and Aunt Carol had taken advantage of her vulnerability. "I felt so alone, Jessica," she confessed, her voice choked. "And they were here. It seemed right to help them. Carol was so ill. Martha told me she needed support. I wanted to be the daughter my father would be proud of, who took care of the family. The problem was that taking care had turned into supporting. In the following days, my mother, with a determination I hadn't seen in her for years, began to delve into the finances. She opened spreadsheets, bank statements, receipts. I helped her, organizing documents, doing calculations. What we discovered left us speechless. "Jessica, look at this," my mother said one afternoon, her fingers trembling as she pointed to a line on a spreadsheet. Over the past 10 years between Carol's trips, Martha's alternative medical expenses, the additional credit cards, the loans that were never repaid, The number she pointed to was astounding. Almost $500,000. $500,000. I could barely believe it. But how? I murmured, shocked. And they don't even know? They know I pay the bills, but they've never seen the total amount. It's always been done in fragmented ways here and there. And they always had an excuse. Carol's depression, Martha's age, the need to keep up appearances. I remembered Aunt Carol's trips, always in new cars, to places like the Grand Canyon, Florida, California. She would post photos on social media, smiling, with stunning landscapes in the background, while my mother tightened her belt to save money. Her depression seemed to be very selective, allowing her to enjoy a life of luxury at my mother's expense. And the worst part, my mother continued, her voice now firm with no trace of sadness, just a cold anger, is that they act like they're doing me a favor by living here, as if this apartment, which my father worked so hard to buy, is their right. In that moment, I saw the lioness awaken in my mother. The woman who had been bowed under the weight of grief and exploitation was rising again, her eyes shining with a new determination. She was no longer the vulnerable Sarah, but the Sarah my father had always admired. Strong, intelligent, and above all, just. "This is going to end, Jessica," she declared, closing the spreadsheet with a thud. "They are not going to turn us into walking ATMs." I felt a mixture of fear and excitement. Fear of the confrontation that was coming, but excitement at the prospect of seeing my mother break free. I knew the battle would be difficult, that Grandma Martha and Aunt Carol wouldn't give in easily. They had grown too accustomed to comfort and control. But, for the first time in a long time, I felt we had a chance. That $500,000 was more than an amount. It was the symbol of a decade of exploitation, and now irrefutable proof that our patience had reached its limit. This story is deeply personal to me, and if you've ever felt something similar, that feeling of being used or seeing someone you love exploited, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share your story in the comments and tell me what city you're watching from, so I know how far this message of strength and liberation can reach. The days that followed the discovery of the $500,000 were filled with a palpable tension, though invisible to Grandma Martha and Aunt Carol. My mother and I communicated through glances, through whispers in the kitchen when they weren't around, or through text messages when we were in different rooms, even within our own apartment. It was as if we were on a secret mission, devising a battle plan against enemies sleeping in the next room. Grandma Martha continued her routine of watching television, making calls to her friends, complaining about minor aches, and demanding special teas, while Aunt Carol, still euphoric about the necklace and the cruise, talked incessantly about the paradisiacal destinations she would visit. "Mom, what are we going to do?" I asked one evening. As my mother reviewed documents in the office, the door closed. She looked up from the papers, a glint of determination in her eyes. "We can't just kick them out, Jessica. Legally, they are long-term guests. And emotionally, it would be a war that would exhaust us. We need to cut off the root of the problem, the money." Her plan was methodical, and to me, frighteningly intelligent. She wouldn't confront them directly about the money right away. Instead, she would begin to tighten the financial noose, gradually, but firmly. The first step was to cut off all the additional credit cards they were using. "They don't even realize I'm the one paying the full bill every month," my mother explained. "They think it's your father's emergency fund, which I manage." I remembered a conversation I had with my father years ago, when I was a child. He was teaching me to play chess and told me, "Jessica, in chess, sometimes the best move isn't to attack directly, but to cut off your opponent's supply lines. Make them feel the pressure before they even realize they're in danger." At that moment, my father's words echoed in my mind, and I saw my mother's strategy in a new light. She was cutting off the supply lines. The execution of the plan began with small steps. First, the additional credit cards were canceled, with the justification of a security review from the bank. Grandma Martha and Aunt Carol complained but accepted it, believing it was just a temporary inconvenience. Then, my mother began to charge a contribution for apartment expenses, something she had never done before. "Martha, Carol, the cost of living in Boston is extremely high. my mother said during dinner, in a calm and professional voice. "I know you're in a delicate situation, but we need you to contribute a small portion towards the electricity, water, and internet bills." Grandma Martha looked at her with disdain. "Sarah, you know I live off my modest pension, and Carol is sick. You're not going to charge us, are you? Where's the family spirit?" "Family spirit also means responsibility, Martha," my mother replied, without flinching. "I'm not asking for much, just the equivalent of a small percentage of the general expenses." The tension at the table was palpable. Aunt Carol, who had been silent until then, cleared her throat. "Mom, maybe we could, I don't know, sell some of my old jewelry? The ones you gave me?" Grandma Martha glared at her. "Nonsense, Carol. Sarah, you can't be serious. David would never do this." David was my father. The mention of him, used as a weapon, hit my mother in a sensitive spot, but she held firm. "David isn't here, Martha. And I am. And I am very serious." That was the first direct confrontation, and although it wasn't an explosion, it was a tremor that shook the false peace of our home. Grandma Martha and Aunt Carol were furious, but my mother didn't back down. They eventually agreed, reluctantly, to make a small contribution, which my mother knew would never be enough. But it was a start. It was a sign that the reins were changing hands. Meanwhile, I felt I needed an ally, someone outside to confide in. My best friend Chloe was that person. She had always been my rock, the only one who truly understood the complexity of my family life. I met her at a cafe near the college. "Chloe, you won't believe what my mother found out," I began, and I poured out the whole story, from the plastic flower to the $500,000. Chloe listened with wide eyes, shocked. "Jessica, that's surreal. Your grandmother and aunt are parasites, and your mother is a saint for putting up with all of this." "I know, but now she's changing. She's cutting off the money, and they're furious." Chloe shook her head. "They're not going to take this easily. They're going to fight. And they're going to try to manipulate your mother. You need to be ready for that." Chloe's words echoed what I already felt. Grandma Martha and Aunt Carol were masters of manipulation. I remembered a time, when I was about 12, and Aunt Carol lost a family ring that Grandma Martha had given her. Grandma Martha made a huge drama, crying and saying the ring was an heirloom and that someone in the house must have taken it. I felt guilty, even though I knew I hadn't touched the ring. My father, noticing the tension, ended up buying an identical ring for Grandma Martha, just to calm the situation. Later, Aunt Carol found the original ring in her purse, acting as if it were a mere oversight. That incident stuck with me, showing how far they would go to get what they wanted. But now, with my mother in charge, the dynamic would be different. Her next step was even more audacious. She planned to sell a small property my father had left in the countryside, a cabin that was used for seasonal rentals. It wasn't the apartment, but it was a source of income they considered guaranteed. And the sale would be the first major seismic shock. I knew Grandma Martha and Aunt Carol would do everything to prevent it, but my mother was determined. The war was just beginning, and I knew their next move would be even dirtier. The news of the cabin's sale dropped like a bomb in the apartment. My mother waited for the right moment, a Sunday dinner, when Grandma Martha and Aunt Carol were particularly relaxed, praising the meal my mother had prepared. She cleared her throat, and I felt my heart quicken. "I have some news for you," my mother said, her voice firm, but with a slight tremor only I noticed. "I've decided to sell the Vermont cabin." Aunt Carol's fork clattered onto her plate. Grandma Martha stopped chewing, her eyes widening. "What?" Grandma Martha asked, her voice rising an octave. "Sell the cabin? But why, Sarah? It's a family property." "It's a property that costs me more than it earns, Martha," my mother replied, maintaining her composure. "And I need liquidity to invest elsewhere, to secure Jessica's future." Aunt Carol, who had been in shock until then, exploded. "But what about my weekend getaways and my recovery vacations? The cabin was the only place where I could find some peace from my depression. You can't do this, Sarah." "You haven't been to the cabin in over a year, Carol," my mother retorted, her patience beginning to wear thin. Your getaways are always to five-star hotels in Arizona or Florida. And honestly, I don't see how selling a cabin in Vermont would drastically affect your depression. Grandma Martha stood up from her chair, slamming her hands on the table. Sarah, you're losing your mind. David would never allow such a thing. This property is an inheritance. David's inheritance is for Jessica Martha, not to support your lifestyle, my mother said, and I saw the fire in her eyes. She had reached her limit. The cabin will be sold. The realtor is already handling everything. Grandma Martha and Aunt Carol turned livid. The night ended in shouts and accusations. Aunt Carol started crying, saying my mother was cruel and insensitive. Grandma Martha threatened to tell everyone about my mother's inhumanity. But my mother didn't back down. She had made her decision, and I was there, by her side, to support her. In the following days, the apartment transformed into a silent battlefield. Grandma Martha and Aunt Carol stopped talking to my mother, except to make passive-aggressive demands. They tried to co-opt me, pulling me into conversations about how my mother was changing, becoming bitter after my father's death. Jessica, your mother wasn't like this, Grandma Martha lamented one day while I was in the kitchen. Your father kept her in line. Now she's out of control. My mother is being responsible, Grandma, I replied, my voice firmer than I expected. She's taking care of her future and mine. Grandma Martha gave me a sharp look, realizing I wouldn't be an ally. Aunt Carol, meanwhile, began to have more frequent depression crises, locking herself in her room, refusing to eat, and then going on even longer road trips, financed by some money I didn't know where it came from, since my mother had cut off access to the funds. It was Aunt Carol's persistence in traveling, even without my mother's money, that intrigued me. If she was so depressed and without resources, how could she afford these trips? I started paying more attention. One day while she was out, I saw her laptop open in the living room. An uncontrollable curiosity propelled me. I knew I shouldn't, but something told me something was wrong. I approached and saw a spreadsheet open. It wasn't a travel expense sheet, but one of profits. And there was the name of a digital marketing company. My heart pounded. Aunt Carol, the depressed woman who couldn't work, had a company? I clicked on a few tabs and saw bank statements with regular, quite substantial deposits. Aunt Carol wasn't just traveling. She was working and doing very well and hiding everything. The depression was a farce to justify her dependence and avoid responsibilities. I felt a wave of shock and anger. My mother had sacrificed for years for a lie. I took photos of the screen with my phone, my heart beating fast. This was the proof we needed. When my mother returned home, I pulled her into the office, locking the door. With trembling hands, I showed her the photos. She looked at the images, and I saw a mixture of disbelief, betrayal, and a silent fury take over her face. She was deceiving us the whole time, my mother whispered, her voice almost inaudible. The depression, the trips, all a farce. The cabin was sold. The money from the sale, which Grandma Martha and Aunt Carol had hoped would be used to help them in some way, was immediately invested in an education fund for me, inaccessible to them. The news of the sale and the money's destination only increased their fury, but they still didn't know about my discovery. I knew that the truth about Aunt Carol would be the next step, and that this revelation would be the final blow, the war cry that would finally shatter the farce they had built. The revelation about Aunt Carol and her secret digital marketing company ignited a fury in my mother that I had never witnessed. It wasn't just anger. It was the pain of betrayal, the humiliation of having been deceived for years by someone in her own family, someone she had supported with so much sacrifice. I felt the same, an indignation that gnawed at me. Aunt Carol's debilitating depression farce, which justified her luxury trips and her life without responsibilities, crumbled before our eyes with the evidence I had collected. My mother decided there would be no more beating around the bush. The confrontation would be direct, no evasions, and it would happen on our territory. She waited for Aunt Carol to return from one of her recovery trips and for Grandma Martha to be present. The tension in the apartment was almost physical, like the air before a storm. I sat beside my mother in the living room, feeling my heart pound, but with unwavering determination. When Aunt Carol entered the room, with her smile of someone who had just returned from a spa, my mother interrupted her before she could begin to tell her stories of overcoming. "Carol, Martha, we need to talk. And this time, there's no room for lies." Grandma Martha frowned, sensing my mother's serious tone. "What is it now, Sarah? Another one of your tantrums?" "It's not a tantrum, Martha. It's the truth," my mother replied, and her eyes fixed on Aunt Carol. "Carol, I know about your digital marketing company. I know about your profits. And I know your depression is a convenient farce to justify a decade of exploitation." Aunt Carol's face paled. The smile vanished, replaced by a look of shock and panic. Grandma Martha, on the other hand, looked confused, then furious. "What? What are you talking about, Sarah? Carol is sick." "No, Martha, she's not," my mother retorted, and then looked at me. "Jessica, please, show them." With slightly trembling hands, I took out my phone and showed them the photos of Aunt Carol's spreadsheets and bank statements. The images spoke for themselves. Grandma Martha's eyes widened as she saw the numbers, the deposits, the company name. Aunt Carol tried to snatch the phone from my hand, but I pulled it away. This is an invasion of privacy," Aunt Carol stammered, her voice failing. "You have no right. And you have the right to live off me for 10 years, faking an illness, while earning a fortune and traveling the country in a car I paid for?" My mother shot back, her voice loud and clear, full of suppressed pain and anger. "You used me, Carol. You used my husband's memory, my grief, my generosity." Grandma Martha, who looked as if she had been punched in the stomach, finally found her voice. "Carol, is this true? You have a company? You were deceiving us?" Aunt Carol, cornered, burst into tears. But they weren't tears of remorse. They were tears of someone caught red-handed. I didn't want you to worry. I wanted to be independent, but the pressure of living in luxury without working?" My mother interrupted her, without patience. "The pressure of watching me pay your bills while you secretly accumulated a fortune?" The discussion turned into an explosion of accusations and denials. Grandma Martha, feeling betrayed by her own daughter, began to yell at Aunt Carol. The house, once a luxurious home, was now a stage for the disintegration of a family. I watched it all, feeling a mixture of sadness and a strange sense of relief. The truth, however painful, was finally coming to light. My mother, exhausted but with a new strength in her gaze, made the final declaration. "I will no longer support you. You have 1 month to find a place to live. This apartment is mine and Jessica's, and it will no longer be a refuge for parasites." The shock on Grandma Martha's and Aunt Carol's faces was indescribable. They tried to argue, plead, manipulate, but my mother was unyielding. She had drawn a line in the sand, and there was no turning back. Aunt Carol, with her secret fortune, had no excuse. Grandma Martha, without my mother's financial support, and with her daughter now exposed, was lost. The confrontation had been brutal, but necessary. The masks had fallen, and the truth, raw and painful, was laid bare for all to see. From that moment on, I knew our lives would never be the same, and that true freedom was finally within our reach. The month that followed the confrontation was a roller coaster of emotions. Grandma Martha and Aunt Carol tried everything to reverse my mother's decision. There were pleas, emotional blackmail, veiled threats, and even attempts to involve distant relatives, who, fortunately, didn't fall into the trap. Aunt Carol, with her hidden money, tried to manipulate Grandma Martha, saying my mother was crazy and that they should resist. But my mother was unwavering. She had finally found her voice and her strength, and there was no silencing her. I was by her side every step of the way, offering moral support, helping to organize things, and simply being present. I remember one afternoon when Grandma Martha tried one last gambit. She sat in the living room with a martyr's expression and began to cry. "Sarah, how can you do this to your own mother-in-law? I am an old, sick woman. Where will I live?" My mother, who was in the office, came into the living room, her eyes firm. "Martha, you are not my responsibility. You have a pension, and your daughter has a successful company. You both have resources. And if you were truly so sick, Carol wouldn't be traveling the country while you're here. Grandma Martha tried to argue, but my mother didn't let her. The truth is, you've taken advantage of my grief, my generosity, and my home for years. That's over. I regret that it came to this point, but the choice was yours. The deadline arrived, and, to our surprise and relief, they actually left. Aunt Carol, with her secret fortune, found an apartment for herself and Grandma Martha in a more modest neighborhood. There were no warm goodbyes, just a heavy silence and resentful glances. I watched them walk out the door with their suitcases, and I felt a lump in my throat. It was the end of an era, painful but necessary. The apartment, once filled with their oppressive presence, suddenly seemed vast, silent in a different way. It was no longer the silence of my father's pain, nor the silence of tension. It was a silence of peace, of relief. My mother and I looked at each other, and a slow, genuine smile formed on her face and on mine. For the first time in years, we could breathe deeply in our own home. The first few days were strange. Their absence was almost a ghost, but a ghost that quickly dissipated. My mother began to reorganize the apartment, moving furniture, painting the room they occupied, transforming it into a meditation and reading space. She was flourishing. She started taking yoga classes, meeting friends she had neglected, traveling, but this time, for genuine pleasure, not out of obligation. I watched her, and I felt immense pride. My mother was rediscovering who she was, beyond a widow, beyond a provider, beyond a victim. She was becoming the vibrant, full-of-life woman my father had loved. I remember one evening, as we had dinner together, just the two of us, in peace. "Jessica, I feel like an enormous weight has been lifted from my shoulders," she said, a sparkle in her eyes. "I thought I needed Martha's approval, that it was my obligation to take care of them. But that wasn't love. It was emotional blackmail. And now?" I asked, curious about the future. "Now, we live," she replied with a smile. "We live for ourselves, for what makes us happy." This new life didn't come without its challenges. Grandma Martha and Aunt Carol tried to spread rumors about my mother, attempting to tarnish her reputation. But my mother, with the dignity that always characterized her, simply ignored them. The people who truly mattered, who knew the truth, remained by our side. I realized that the loss of an ally Chloe had mentioned wasn't the loss of a friend, but the loss of the illusion that Grandma Martha and Aunt Carol were part of a loving family. The emotional rupture had happened, but it freed us. One day, I received an unexpected message from a distant cousin who lived in another state. She had heard the rumors and wanted to know the truth. I told her everything, and she was shocked. "Jessica, I always thought it was strange how Aunt Carol was always traveling and Grandma Martha always seemed to have money for everything, even while complaining about her pension, but I never imagined it would be like this. Your mother did the right thing." This conversation showed me that the truth, no matter how much they tried to hide it, always finds a way. And our truth was strengthening us, uniting us even more. The freedom my mother and I had gained was more than the absence of Grandma Martha and Aunt Carol. It was the freedom to be ourselves, to build a home based on genuine love and respect, not on obligation and exploitation. And I knew that, despite everything, the future held something good for us, something we were building brick by brick, with our own hands. Time, like a rushing river, continued its course, washing away the hurts and bringing new landscapes. The apartment, once a stage for tensions and dramas, had transformed into a sanctuary of peace and laughter. My mother and I built a routine that nourished us, full of deep conversations, quiet dinners, and the freedom to simply be. She was happier than I had seen her since my father's death, and I, in turn, flourished in college, with a lighter mind and a more open heart. Grandma Martha and Aunt Carol became distant figures, almost ghosts of a past we preferred not to revisit. They tried to make contact a few times, with generic messages and calls that my mother gently ignored or answered briefly. There was no anger, just a healthy distance. The wound was still there, but it no longer bled. It was about a year after the confrontation that something unexpected happened. A letter arrived in the mail, with the stamp of a distant state. The sender was Aunt Carol. My mother picked up the envelope, and I saw hesitation in her eyes, but also curiosity. She opened it and began to read, and I watched her, trying to decipher the emotions on her face. The letter was long, handwritten, and the handwriting was different from the hurried one I knew. It was more careful, more thoughtful. My mother read in silence for a long time and then handed me the letter. "Dear Sarah," it began, "I know you may never read this or that. If you do, you may not want to forgive me. But I need to write. Since we left your apartment, my life has changed in a way I never imagined. At first, I was furious, blaming you for everything. But, with time, and without your money to support me, I was forced to face reality. My company, yes, it's real. And I built it in secret, afraid that Mom or you would judge me for not being sick. The depression, it existed, but I used it as a crutch, an excuse not to grow up, not to take responsibility. I hid behind it, and behind you. I am so sorry, Sarah. I'm sorry for deceiving you, for taking advantage of your kindness and your pain. I'm sorry for treating you like an ATM, and not like the incredible woman you are. Mom is living with me now, and it has been difficult. She still doesn't understand the extent of what I did, or perhaps she doesn't want to understand. But I am learning to support myself, to be an adult. And I am learning that true love is not about what you can take from others, but about what you can give, about respect and honesty. I don't expect your forgiveness, Sarah. I just wanted you to know that I finally understand. You weren't punishing us. You were freeing us. And, in some way, I am grateful for that. I hope you and Jessica are well, and that you have found the peace you both so deserve. With regret, Carol." I finished reading, and a sigh escaped my lips. It was a genuine apology, something I never thought I would see. My mother took the letter back, and her eyes were teary, but with a sparkle of understanding, not sadness. "She's growing," my mother said, her voice soft. "It's a start." She didn't answer the letter immediately. My mother explained to me that some wounds need time to heal completely before they can be touched again, that some relationships need space to be rebuilt on a foundation of truth, not obligation. Perhaps one day, they could find a way back to each other. But for now, the peace we had found was too precious to be disturbed. The liberation my mother and I experienced was complete, free from guilt, free from manipulation, free from the exhausting task of trying to buy a love that should have been given freely. I graduated from college with my mother's unconditional support and began my own professional journey, inspired by her strength and resilience. Our home, the luxury apartment my father had built, finally became what he always wanted, a safe haven, full of love, respect, and the joy of a family that chose each other and that freed itself. And so, my friends, my story ends. A story of pain, of discovery, of confrontation, but above all of liberation, and a love that reinvents itself. If you've made it this far, I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for accompanying me on this journey. If this story resonated with you, if you've been through something similar, or if it inspired you in any way, please subscribe to the channel and share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your own experiences, and who knows, your ideas might inspire our next story. Gratitude is a feeling that connects us, and I am immensely grateful to have you here.